Consider this QL language. It has the proper name S, which refers to Socrates, a one-place predicate P that expresses the property of being a philosopher, a one-place predicate R that expresses the property of being red-haired, and a two-place predicate A that expresses the admirers relation. We set the domain of quantification as all people. Now, how should we translate the following statements? 1, only philosophers are red-haired. 2, only those who admire Socrates are philosophers. We'll start with the first claim. To translate it properly, it's important to distinguish it from the statement that all philosophers are red-haired, which is different. To see how the two are different, first, imagine a scenario where there are exactly 4 individuals in the world: Socrates, Plato, Cleopatra, and Hannibal. Imagine that 3 of them are red-haired: Socrates, Plato, and Cleopatra. And now imagine further that exactly 2 of the 4 are philosophers: Socrates and Plato. In this scenario, it's true that all philosophers are red-haired because both Socrates and Plato are red-haired. But it's not true that only philosophers are red-haired, because in this scenario, there's a non-philosopher, namely Cleopatra, who's red-haired. So all philosophers are red-haired doesn't imply that only philosophers are red-haired. Even if all philosophers are red-haired, there could still be some non-philosophers among the red-haired as well. What about the other way around? Does only philosophers are red-haired imply that all philosophers are red-haired? Well, imagine again a scenario where there are exactly 4 individuals in the world: Socrates, Plato, Cleopatra, and Hannibal. And once again, suppose that exactly 2 of them are philosophers: Socrates and Plato. But now imagine that there's just one individual that's red-haired: Socrates. In this scenario, of course, it's false that all philosophers have red hair, because Plato is a philosopher who doesn't have red hair. But it's true that only philosophers have red hair. And that's true because we don't find any non-philosophers in the red-haired group. If either Cleopatra or Hannibal were red-haired, that would make it incorrect to say that only philosophers have red hair. But because there aren't any non-philosophers in the red-haired group, that's what makes it true to say that only philosophers are red-haired. So, only philosophers are red-haired doesn't imply that all philosophers are red-haired. It just implies that we won't find any non-philosophers among those who have red hair. And that gives us a clue as to how to translate only philosophers have red hair. We can just see that statement as saying that there isn't any non-philosopher who has red hair. Or equivalently, we can see it as saying that everyone who has red hair is a philosopher. If we read it in the first way, then that would yield the translation, it's not the case that there is an X such that not PX and RX. In other words, there is no one that both fails to be a philosopher and is red-haired. If we read it in the second way, then that would give us the translation for each X, if RX, then PX. If a person is red-haired, then they're a philosopher. Both will work as translations of only philosophers have red hair. Those 2 ways of translating only philosophers have red hair exemplify the 2 different ways that there are in general for translating statements of the form only F are G. We can read a statement like that in 2 ways. We can see only F are G as saying it's not the case that there is something which fails to be F and yet still is G. Or we can read it as saying every G is F. So as another example, let's do only those who admire Socrates are philosophers. Here we have another statement of the form only F are G. In this case, the statement is saying that only those who meet the condition of admiring Socrates, that's the condition F in this example, meet the condition of being a philosopher. That's the condition G in this example. So we can read the statement in 2 different ways. We could see it as saying there isn't anyone who fails to admire Socrates that is a philosopher, or we could see it as saying everyone who is a philosopher admires Socrates. The The first option leads us to the translation, it's not the case that there is an x, such that not AXS and PX, whereas the second option leads us to the translation for each x, if PX, then AXS. Again, either would work as a translation for only those who admire Socrates are philosophers.